Hey, I'm Brycen with Trick Tools. I want to welcome you guys to episode 5 of our drag bike body series. In this episode, we're going to be showing you guys how to weld and metal finish your project. I'm going to show you guys the way I would do it and what has worked for me in the past. Now, there's many different ways to metal finish when it comes to the grinding and the steps necessary to get your welds to basically be gone in your panel. So I'm going to show you the TIG welding process, which is what I use, and it's what has worked for me. And I'm also going to show you how I grind the welds down and hammer those out to get this nice smooth finish on your panel. So we've already done the front side of the bike here, and we're going to be now working on the tail section. And then once we get the tail section to look pretty much like the front does here, we're then going to join the two together. We'll get those welded and metal finished, and then this body is just about complete. So let's get started. Before we get started on the rear of the bike, we wanted to give you guys a quick look at the front and what it took to get the front section done, metal finished out. So here's the process on that, and then once we get to the rear, we'll explain the steps that were used here on the back of the bike. Okay, so to get started, when you go to weld your panels together, once you've got them tacked, I like to tack them about every inch to inch and a half. So that's pretty much what you see going around the top here, tacked about every inch and a half. And basically what I like to do is go ahead and use a grinder to just knock the tops off of these tacks. Now this would be for aluminum. On steel, your tacks are often a lot flatter, so it's not as big of a deal. But on aluminum, you have more material there when you add the rod in. So I like to knock these tops off, because when you go to weld it, what's going to happen is every time you run over one of these tacks, your weld's going to be a little bit bigger. So for the metal finishing process, I like to go ahead and knock these tacks off. That way when I weld over, the weld's nice and flat, and then at that point it makes it easier for sanding the weld down after the fact. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the welding here, but first I'm going to grind these tacks off, and then before I actually start the welding, I'm going to use a stainless wire brush to brush the seam to clean out any impurities, and then I'll also blow it out with an air hose just to make sure that there's nothing laying on here that can contaminate the weld. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that and show you guys how that's done. Okay, so we've got these tacks grinded just a little bit to knock the tops off. Do not grind it down all the way to the surface of the material itself. It's basically just to flatten it just a little bit, because once we weld over it, it will just blend right in with our panel and the weld. So got that done, wire brushed it. So it's nice and clean, ready for welding. And a couple things, while I was grinding that, and especially with aluminum and stainless, and I try to wear it even when I'm working with steel as well, is to have yourself a nice respirator. So just get yourself something that protects your breathing, because breathing in the metal dust from grinding, especially stainless and aluminum, is pretty terrible for you. So I always wear a respirator. You should get yourself one too. Always wear gloves, safety glasses, hearing protection. Might not look cool or sound cool or whatever, but basically there's nothing like being able to have your hearing when you're old. I'm not quite there yet, but I know some people who can't really hear now because they never wore any of the earplugs or any of that sort of thing. So always wear eye and ear protection. Get yourself a good set of gloves. I use these welding sleeves a lot of times because they're a lot cooler than wearing a big welding jacket or that sort of thing, but you can still protect your skin from the ultraviolet rays from TIG welding. So it's never a bad thing to protect yourself. So do what you need to do to get that done. So for right now, we are going to start on the TIG welding. So I'm going to be welding at around 80 amps, and that's AC welding. So what I'm going to be doing, basically, I don't like to jump around. So I like to just weld it continuously straight through, start one place, end all the way around. So I don't like to jump around. Some people like to jump around, but my theory on that is anytime you weld something, it's going to shrink. So if you weld a little spot here, you weld a little spot here, you weld a little spot here, you weld a little spot there, weld a little spot there, it's going to shrink, 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 shrink in these different spots. And then when you go through your next round and you weld those, a couple spots in between, it's going to shrink in there. Well, what happens is when that's all done and you get it all welded, you end up with, because of your tacks, you end up with these little waves. Everywhere you had a little stitch and then you moved, you end up with these little waves all through there. Well, I've always found that to be a little bit harder to metal finish out. Whereas if you just start at one end and weld all the way through the other, you have a nice even shrink in your weld all the way through, because it's pulling all in through one pass. So I try to weld, and it doesn't have to be necessarily weld the whole thing without stopping. Weld until you get in a position where you might not be comfortable anymore, move over. As long as you're continuing on within a few seconds time, for me that usually works pretty well. So I'll weld as far as I can get until I need to adjust myself, and then I'll continue on the next section. So I'm going to go ahead and start welding this right around 80 amps. This is 3003 aluminum, and I use 1100 TIG rod, which 1100 is pure aluminum. So it's a soft, filler rod to be able to add in here, and it leaves your weld still pretty soft when you're done. Makes it pretty easy to metal finish out. So I'm going to go ahead and get going on the welding. We have our holes from some clecos and also the panel grippers. So the panel gripper holes that are really close to the seam, I'm going to go ahead and hit those as I'm welding the seam up as I go around. So we're going to get started on the welding. Once we get that done, I'll explain the next steps of metal finishing. So now we have the tail section welded on the top side, but when you TIG weld aluminum, even with some really good penetration to the back side, a lot of times what happens is you can actually see a little bit of the seam remaining on the back, on the underside of your weld. So what you have to do is go in and then just fuse the back side of that seam. You don't have to add any more rod as long as you have proper penetration. All you got to do is just fuse the back side over your weld. It goes really quickly because you're not adding rod, you're not trying to penetrate and make the full, I guess the full weld like you would be on the top side. So all you're trying to do is fuse it just to close up that little seam that is left on the back side. Like I said, it's a pretty quick process, so we're going to go ahead and take this off, get this fused, and then we'll actually start the metal finishing process. All right, we have the inside of the welds fused together, and so now what I'm going to be doing is the first start of the metal shaping process of what I like to do. So basically, obviously, you have the thickness of the weld here. So if you were to look at it, magnified, you have your flat panel, then you have a weld on there. And what I like to do is I usually grab a 36 grit disc just because it removes material quickly, and you can really just knock right on the edge of the disc right on the top of the weld. And basically I just like the tacks before I welded, I like to just knock the top off of the weld. So that way when I do start hammering, I'm already starting with a flatter weld, and it makes it a lot easier to blend into the panel. So I actually go through and I do both sides, and it's really just to smooth out, knock the top off the weld and just smooth out any roughness or just the little beads from the welding itself. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and knock that off, and when I do that, I'm just going to be hitting the weld. Obviously, sometimes you might catch a little bit of the material, whatever, but I'm not using a lot of pressure, so I'm basically going to be just knocking the top off the weld and leaving it at that. And then once I do that both inside and outside, then I'll go through and actually hammer it to start getting it to be more flat and true of how I need it to be. And then at that point, depending on how the weld looks and that sort of thing, I might hit it with a 60 grit disc just to start blending it in, while also hammering and planishing on it as well. So we're going to get started with the metal shaping and or with the metal finishing, and I'm going to go ahead and start grinding this with a 36 grit disc and then hammering it from there. All right, so we have sanded on these welds on both the inside and out, and then I ran it through the planishing hammer to smooth out the panel a little bit. What I'm going to do now is go through with a 60 grit disc and just knock off any of the imperfections that planishing brought out in the weld, the little bit of highs and lows. So I'm going to go through and sand that real quick, and then we'll planish a little bit more, and we should be really close to being able to just sand it out with 120 grit, and then with a Scotch-Brite disc, and do any fine-tune hammer and dolly from there with any spots we see that may need a little bit extra work. So we're going to grind right now with 60 grit, and then we'll jump back on the planishing hammer. All right, so I've got the seam around the sides from about here all the way around to the back. I've got those, I would say 98% done. Might have a little bit of fine tuning to do, but now I'm gonna go ahead and keep working on these front seams here, some hammer and dolly work. I'm pretty much gonna try to finish this all off by hand. So I'm gonna go ahead and start hammering and dolly on this up here, get this all dialed in to this point, and then we'll get these side seams metal finished out, and then we'll work on fitting the two front and rear together and get those attached. All right, so to recap how we got to this point on the body, once we had the welding done, we used a 36 grit to knock the tops off the welds, and then we started a little bit of hammer and dolly and planishing to start to smooth out the panels. Then we used a 60 grit disc to really flatten the weld out, and then continued after that with planishing and hammer and dolly work to be able to really get the panels nice and smooth. So once we got into that point, we used a 120 grit disc to really just blend the surface of the weld into the base material, and then we did some last minute hammer and dolly work and planishing before we used a Scotch-Brite disc and a 150 grit DA to create the nice uniform finish that you see on here. So typically this would be ready for body and paint work at this point, but we are not going to be painting this body. So what we're going to actually do is take it a little further and create somewhat of a reflective finish on the body. Not mirror finish, but just a more of a brighter finish on here. So we'll be taking it a little bit further with DA sanding, but we'll cover that in our next episode. So stay tuned for the next episode coming soon. We want to thank you guys for sticking with us so far. It's been fun, and hopefully you've learned some stuff. And once the next video comes out, it will be the last one. So we'll do some final stuff with the body and really show you guys all the details of this thing in its final finish. So stick around for the last episode coming soon. We'll see you then.